You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good. I'm having all the caffeine today. Just getting up to speed. But, I wanted to mention we met a new colleague the other day, Andrew, and he pointed out that he went into the Apple Podcast search bar and searched for access management. And we were the first podcast that was returned. So I'd say we are definitely in the top 10 now. I think, my plea to our great, fantastic guests who have been so awesome about, reaching out to us and connecting on LinkedIn is keep doing that. And then also, if you think it's worth it, go out, subscribe to the podcast if you're not already, leave a 5-star review. That would be fantastic. Notice I did say the 5-star part. I feel like that's such a shield for the podcast, but I don't like doing that. But at the same time, we want to get the podcast out to more people, right? I think a lot of people reach out to us and say, "Oh, I didn't even know your podcast existed." And so if more people know about it, then I think we'll get more listeners. And that's really about, getting the best practices and getting the word out there.
I think the only thing that I will correct on that is I read this morning that Apple is changing their verbiage to no longer be subscribe and to be to follow a podcast, because there is this perception sometimes that podcasts cost money because of the subscription element to it. So I guess follow us on Apple and Spotify and wherever. I guess listen, share. Obviously, the reviews and stuff certainly help from a search ranking perspective and things like that. But yeah, all right. Well, that's enough of a commercial. I think for us, there's literally dozens of people out there who might be interested in that. We should talk about a couple of things that we've been mentioning. Things like Identiverse 2021. That's coming up here in June 21st to 23rd. It's both in person in Denver and also virtual. So you can kind of, I hate to say pick your poison, but that's kind of where we're at right now, right?
Well, I'd like to go in person because I need some new t-shirts, and I'm hoping to get to the vendor hall and get some free t-shirts.
Yeah, maybe hit up the, I think it's Okta the last couple of years has had like the t-shirt machine where you can sort of customize it. I think they learned their lesson after the first year doing that, where maybe some people, I won't say who, were maybe submitting text that probably wasn't appropriate.
But the hats were cool. I think at the last in-person Gartner, they had hats that you could kind of pick your own patch and where you wanted it. I thought that was super cool.
Yeah, I found my I Am Hero Okta hat recently. I think it was like a couple days ago. And maybe at some point, if we ever go on video, right, that'll be a nice background prop.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've also got Identity Management Day. That is April 13th. That's something that we've been talking about. It's a kind of a cool thing that the Identity Defined Security Alliance has been putting together over at identitymanagementday.org. So hopefully folks will celebrate with us on that day. I got an email from them, I think was it yesterday, asking for like tips for best practices and things that organizations struggle with. So I'm curious to see what they'll do with that information as they collect it from the folks who are taking part. So that's something that also, you can get more information about it. Again, identitymanagementday.org, or you can go to our website where I've placed a very handy little click button that you can go right to their website with, because yay, internet. All right, I think enough kind of talk here. I know we want to talk about privacy and consent today. That is a topic that is more and more becoming intertwined with IAM in a whole bunch of different ways. I'll be honest, it's not an area that I am super strong with. So I'm very happy that we're able to get one of our experts on here. Her name is Katie Stevens. She's a director with Protiviti Security and Privacy Practice, and she's also the lead for Privacy as a Service. I want to welcome you to the show, Katie.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So one of our first questions that we always ask our guests is, how did you get into, the InfoSec space, the IAM space? And obviously, we're going to talk through security and privacy at some point too, but maybe you can kind of take us through kind of your journey and how you've gotten into this. Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, I definitely chose identity access management, but privacy came completely accidentally for me. I was exposed to identity access management very early in my career when I started my first job at Sprint. I joined their software development team, and my job was to really be the production gatekeeper. I was responsible for moving code from the test environment to production. And as part of that role, I also managed what we used to call the fire call ID process. I think you may be familiar with that term, is when you really grant developers temporary access for emergency situations. Well, back then we didn't have tools like CyberArk and had to do all this manually. So I remember myself carrying a pager 24/7, manually provisioning access and removing access. So it was quite a bit of a nightmare, but this is the first time when I learned about segregation of duties and why restriction of access is important. So that was when I first really became passionate about identity access management. Just to kind of fast forward a little bit, my career then took off. I went to JP Morgan Chase, and I spent about 8 years there doing identity management, information security, and data protection. So at that time, I got exposed to privacy laws like the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the GLBA, that controls and governs financial services. And I really didn't think that privacy was on my radar early on in my career. But as I started to learn more about the privacy regulations in Europe, and my background, I actually grew up in Russia, and in Russia we had very little privacy. So as I started to follow some of these privacy laws and regulations, I got very interested. So when the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe was passed into law in 2016, I really jumped at the opportunity to help operationalize our model and help our clients. And now I lead our global rollout of the managed privacy services.
All right. So you piqued my interest about growing up in Russia. So you have to dive into that just briefly. What was that like?
Oh, well, I have lots of stories. I mean, I moved to the United States when I was 15. So I actually started high school. I moved from Russia to Iowa. My parents had a job with Iowa State University. So it was a huge culture shock. But Russia was very simple life. Lines to go everywhere in stores. People wore very similar clothes. Again, now that I know what privacy is, a lot of messaging that was delivered to us in school and just, broadly to population was very controlled. So again, this is going from very little privacy to what we have today with GDPR is like night and day.
Very interesting. I don't know if we've had anyone that has that Russia experience on the show. So thank you for bringing it. You mentioned privacy as a service, and I always think that's an interesting kind of approach. What does that actually mean? What is privacy as a service?
Yeah, privacy as a service is a managed service that helps our client quickly stand up and sustain ongoing privacy operations. What we seen early on when GDPR first came to light, that a lot of companies, especially US companies, practice this wait to see approach, right? They weren't sure what was going to happen and how the GDPR was going to be enforced globally. So now those companies are struggling to catch up with the new and enhanced privacy laws. And this is when privacy as a managed service really comes in. We can quickly deploy the program, maintain it, manage it, report to the DPO, and really be arms and legs for the organization to execute their privacy needs and privacy obligations.
I thought the Russian angle was interesting as well. I think that we're probably around the same age and kind of grew up in that time frame where you had movies like Top Gun and Rocky 3 or Rocky 4, where Ivan Drago is kind of the bad guy, and it's interesting that you've kind of morphed into the world of privacy. You mentioned there was not much privacy expectation in Russia. I don't know. I was at a conference maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It was a ForgeRock conference, and one of their board members was the former CEO of Sun Microsystems, Scott McNealy. He made the statement, "You have zero privacy. Get over it." Kind of like the folks that are deciding what to do with your data are the big, or not even just big tech, but just the technical world, or the computer world. Your data is now in the system and is being pushed around. One thing that I find extremely frustrating is when I have to use a website. So I have to do online banking, or I have to have an account with my electric utility or something like that. And they say, this is our privacy policy. Do you accept or not accept? If I do not accept, I cannot use their website. Now, how is that fair? How does that really give me an option? So I'm actually going to pose the question at a very simple level, but feel free to freestyle. What is privacy and consent? Because to me, that's not consent, right? I'm not really consenting to give my information. I'm not really agreeing to their privacy policy. I'm being forced to. That's not freedom.
You're absolutely right, Jim. When we talk about consent, we have to really keep in mind that the privacy laws are designed for individuals, and for those individuals to really gain better control and transparency over collection, use of their personal data by companies. So this means that in most cases, individuals must have a choice to be able to prevent the collection and usage without impacting the service. So consent is simply a mechanism on how you capture that, but there's two distinct consent types. So the first one is the affirmative consent, what we call the opt-in, right? That's where you actually have to opt in order for them to collect the data. And the second type is implicit consent. It's implied. So, if you accept that privacy notice, it's implied that you've consented. Now, with the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, the implicit consent is not legal. It does not exist. So I think that's where one of the significant differences, where some of the privacy laws in the world are not requiring that explicit consent, and the GDPR does. So we're starting to see companies that are global companies go through this transformation effort to really obtain consent. And oh, by the way, they can't just accept blanket consent. If they're going to share data with third parties, they have to obtain specific consent. If they're going to use it for marketing purposes, they have to obtain specific consent. So every purpose requires for you to consent, opt in, and then also allow you the right to then opt out and withdraw your consent, which means they have to go back and delete that information upon you executing that right. So you're absolutely right, Jim. I think we're going to see this practice evolve, and as U.S. regulations, as California Consumer Privacy Act, which is now CPRA, the new Virginia privacy law, I think we're going to see some more maturity, but we're not there yet.
So you mentioned a few different new laws, at least here in the U.S., that have come up recently. Maybe we should start with GDPR, because I feel like that is kind of the big one that most people, or at least have awareness. They may not all the details, but they know that GDPR is a thing, right? And we have to kind of account from a usability standpoint, but also from a data collection. And then what does that mean for users and being able to manage their data? So maybe let's start with GDPR, and then we can talk about California and Virginia and the US. What is GDPR in a nutshell?
Yeah, so if you think about GDPR, it is perhaps the most sweeping law that came out in the last 20 years. I mean, it really set the standard. And the reason for that, for the change, right, in Europe, very similar to what we're going through in the United States, each country had a data protection a regulation that was slightly different, and it was very difficult to comply. So the European Data Protection Board came together with all the member countries, and they decided to pass this general data protection regulation, which is actually much stricter to what they had before. And let me tell you why. So, in Europe, in order for you to collect the data, you must have a legal basis. What this means is you can't just go and collect data from individuals. You need to either have a contract with them and have a service. You need to have a regulatory, maybe a requirement to collect the data. You need to obtain consent, or even use legitimate interest. So there's all these legal mechanisms that you have to apply before you collect the data. If that data does not rely on legal basis, that data is illegal and must be deleted. So some of the latest and probably the largest fines that you'll see in Europe that have been issued related to GDPR is because data is collected without that legal basis, right? So it becomes very important. Unfortunately, we don't have that yet in the United States. We're starting to do purpose limitations, but the formal legal basis is not in place. The second significant change was the right to be forgotten, and having access to data. So if the individual wants to exercise their rights, now they are able to go to companies and request to be deleted. Now there's some exceptions that apply. Right. Again, I always tell my clients, if you want to have no privacy requirements, go delete all your data. So companies can't just go delete data right and left. So, if the data is necessary to finish processing of a transaction, if it's required to be kept for regulatory reasons, right, retention policies, there are some exceptions when that deletion does not apply. Another significant requirement, right, the data protection officer is now required for most organizations in Europe. And this concept, privacy by design and by default, have you heard that term before?
Yeah, heard it. Maybe you can explain it for folks who are listening that aren't as familiar.
Yeah, so privacy by design and by default is this practice for building privacy into the design and supportive systems. And it applies very simply in two areas. Number one, when companies are implementing new technology or changing technology, they have to incorporate privacy upfront, very similar to how we now refer to DevSecOps, right? We had to do that with security many, many years ago. So privacy is starting to really get embedded into initial evaluation of technology, because if you don't build privacy and you go to production and you can't fulfill some of those requirements, it's a significant fine. So companies, number one, have to embed this into their DevOps as DLC. The second piece about privacy by default is all about data minimization. So how many companies do you know, Jeff and Jim, that delete data up on their retention policy?
None.
That's right. I don't know a lot of those companies. And, historically, all the, large corporations that I've ever worked for, it was the more data we have, the better. Well, now that is really shifting, because now if you don't have, again, if you have a retention schedule, you can keep the data for that long, but then anything beyond the retention schedule has to be deleted. So it's a very significant challenge for organizations to take their retention policies that are written by legal, and for IT to take that retention policy and really operationalize it at the data layer is very challenging.
There's a couple of things that I find really interesting about GDPR, and the first and foremost is probably the most public one. It's the fine structure or the penalty. It is a percentage of, as I understand it, at least profit or revenue, for the organization, which can be pretty substantial, right? If you're a global organization, we've seen, in the millions, maybe tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of fines for potential, violations and things like that. Do you have any perspective on how that might translate over to some of the U.S. regulations that are coming up?
Yeah, it's a very great question. So even with GDPR, if you talk to some of the privacy practitioners, we didn't see those fines come out early on, because the data protection authorities really took their time to evaluate and give companies a chance to fix it. And some of the fines that you see that are coming now, those have been in the works, and very large fines. The reason why I'm telling you this is because, legal frameworks, right, they're tested in court, they're tested in real life. So I think that what we've seen in Europe, that those are being enforced, are going to really happen here as well. The CCPA actually has no unlimited liability. So if you have, a million records, I think it's 7,500 per record, essentially your fines could be significant, but also the California residents can then take private right of action and sue you for damages, right? So again, at least in Europe, they put a cap on it. I know it's a large one, but here in California, it is unlimited liability.
So Katie, I think there's a perception out there that I've heard people state over time, which is, if we look at GDPR, we figure out a way to comply with GDPR, we're good with CCPA, and assume that rolls on to the new Virginia law as well. I know you're going to talk about those a little bit, but is that a common sense approach, or is that just too simple?
Yeah, and again, I've worked for JP Morgan Chase and large financial services. That's really the approach that they take at the global level. GDPR is a very good standard to follow. And I think, again, CCPA is a great example because it started CCPA, which was maybe 50, 60% of GDPR. Now CPRA is going to be closer to GDPR. However, there are some differences. So the way that we approach privacy for global organizations, we've actually built, before the NIST privacy framework came out, we built a model that aligns to GDPR. And then it also identifies areas that are special to a certain jurisdiction. For example, in California, we have requirements related to the sale of data. GDPR doesn't have that. So that would be an example where it's an add-on to the GDPR baseline. Now, when you think about that approach, it becomes very pricey for companies to do that, right? So depending on your operations in Europe versus US, you may decide to take a different approach. I mean, I've had clients when GDPR first came out, their business was so small in Europe that they actually stopped doing business in Europe because it was too expensive for them to comply.
Yeah, I remember there was kind of like the apocalypse with websites, not allowing visitors from different countries or parts of the world because of that. You talked about California and Virginia laws. There's CCPA, and then there's now the CDPA. Can you talk a little bit about those two? I know you kind of briefly mentioned California, but maybe we can talk a little bit in the context of how are they the same and what are the key differences between the two?
Sure. So, CDPA, again, it's very new. It's a Virginia law that was recently passed. And the CDPA applicability is a little bit different than CCPA. So in California, the CCPA applies to any organization that does business in California and that has, thresholds. It's a for-profit organization and that meets certain thresholds. And it applies to organizations not even located in Virginia. In California. It applies to organizations that are located all over the United States, as long as they're doing business, right? Which means they bring a portion of revenue from the state of California. For Virginia, the applicability is a little bit different. You actually have to be doing business and registered in the state of Virginia. So the scope for Virginia law is much smaller than CCPA. So that's one difference. Another difference is CCPA is now going to the Privacy Rights and Enforcement Act, the CPRA, which will be much closer to GDPR, and that will include data minimization, which is data retention. It will include privacy by design, and it will include some of these additional controls that are currently not in CCPA. So the Virginia privacy law, and again, Jeff, I'll be honest with you, I'm still trying to get up to speed too. It's like every week there's a new law that's popping up. But my understanding is that Virginia law is very focused on transparency and consumer rights, very similar to where CCPA started.
I think this highlights kind of the challenge that, at least in the US and some people are facing, especially in the IAM space, is we have this kind of patchwork of, local laws. There's nothing, at the federal level that kind of governs over all of this. And it makes it very difficult, I think, for organizations to kind of figure out, what am I supposed to comply with? Who does it apply to? What are we supposed to do about it? And I feel like this kind of roots back into proper IAM, right? At the end of the day, and feel free to, tear me apart if my thinking is wrong, because I'm happy to grow on it, is all of these privacy laws are designed around, the appropriate use of the data for the user themselves. So if you have proper identity and access management controls in place, regardless of the laws that are getting put together, you should be in a pretty good state from a compliance. There might be a couple of extra mile kind of things that might have to go around it, but I think of things like, from SOX, right? The good old days of Sarbanes-Oxley, it's kind of like old hat now. It's, is the access appropriate for the person? And the appropriateness is really, liberally defined, right? It's the manager say it's okay. As long as the manager said it was okay, it's fine, right? But you need to be able to basically prove that the access was granted in the process that it was mandated, right, through the organization. So as long as you're following kind of the basics of IAM, do I have a record of the access, when it was given, who it was given by? if there was an approval process, who approved it, and then that access is removed in a timely manner, again, subject to perhaps a liberal definition of what timely means, that you should be in a relatively good state from a compliance standpoint. Now, I know a lot of organizations struggle with that, right? And that's why IAM is a thing. But does that thinking of, let's at least get proper base controls, will that take me a long way towards meeting some of the compliance things, no matter kind of where they come?
Yeah, you highlighted two main points. And if you think about the scenario you outlined, I would break this out into two different scenarios. One is your employees and access for your employees, right? So one, employees also have rights and they can also execute them. So with employees, if you can identify them, which most organizations can, but also restricting their access only to systems that are authorized, right? That's a big data protection control, which will help prevent and exposure of the data. Now, the second piece that you highlighted, right, that if you think about all the external identities, organizations are good at managing customers and consumers, hopefully. Where we get into challenges, think about marketing data. Have you ever had to implement an identity management system on marketing data?
Briefly, and it sucks.
Or vendors. I guess if your vendors have access to your system, that you know them, but potentially vendors that may not have access to your system that provide a sub-processor type service. So I think that you're absolutely right. The identity management controls are foundational. So having those mature and in the right state with effectiveness, the right effectiveness is very important, because the data protection piece of all privacy regulations relies on that foundational control. For those organizations that manage customer identities, that digital identity of your consumer experience is going to be very important with privacy, because as individuals exercise their rights, they can also use their online accounts and portals where you can start setting those privacy settings, and they can just go in and out and decide what they can and cannot do. So managing those identities becomes very important. And I guess the third step is identifying all the identities for which you're collecting data, but may not have any tools in place to validate them.
Katie, I'd like to bring up a related topic. I'm not sure if it really falls into the space of privacy and consent, but it's certainly something that a lot of organizations are struggling with, which is data residency, and determining when there are regulations that require that they store identity data kind of in country, within the walls of a certain country. And the ones that I see pop up the most recently are Russia, China, where actually that, rather than storing a person's identifiable information in one database wherever in the world, US, somewhere in Europe, those are countries that maybe have some requirements. I know in the past we've talked about Germany and France, and I think primarily those were, at least from my experience when I was doing workforce identity implementations and having to keep that data resident within that country's borders. But just as a general question, are you seeing that the regulatory landscape is moving more toward data residency requirements or away from that? And where do you see that it's, those requirements are the strongest?
Yeah, Jim, excellent question. And again, we deal with a lot of those questions from our clients. And now with, I'm sure you've heard the Privacy Shield and validation, it's becoming even more difficult. So let me first explain 2 points. So data residency is a practice when a company can decide where their data is, right? So data residency, they decide we're going to keep our data here, and we're going to use contractual means and obligations to make sure that data doesn't leave the country. Now, what you mentioned about China and Russia, those are data localization laws, and those are dictated by the data that originates in this country or a region, right? And sometimes for China, it's a region. The data must stay in the same territory. And so the reason why I'm distinguishing between those two, because data residency, again, it's a strategy. Where do you go? And let me talk about that one first. When we talk about data residency, when you decide where the data is, right, you want to prevent cross-border data transfers. And just picture this example. Let's say that you mentioned Germany. Germany and France, they do have special local localization requirements that are not as strict as China. But let's just play out the scenario that you decided that your data is going to be in Germany, for example, right? And if company engineers are in India and they are accessing that data from India, right? They're not physically transferring the data, but they're only accessing that data in Germany. So in that scenario, it's still considered a move and the residency is broken, right? So I think when you think about data residency, you really have to ask yourself, am I doing it for compliance reasons? Am I doing it for, protection of the data, making sure you know where it goes, or something else? And I always tell my clients that if you can keep your data in Europe, it's much easier for you to comply. But realistically, with this global footprint and how we're all accessing data, that virtual transfer happens very easily, right? Unless you put a perimeter around your European data center where nobody can get in and out. So that's one point. The second point for data localization laws, and I'll start with China because it features the most comprehensive list of strict requirements. And I know they're changing slightly, but that law defines two operator types, the network operator and then the critical infrastructure operator. But those definitions are so broad, most of the time they apply to all foreign organizations. And with this requirement, all personal information that's collected in China must be stored on servers located in China. And if you want to take that data elsewhere, you have to, if you want to transfer that data outside of the country, you have to receive government permission and you have to undergo a security review. So it's a pretty strict requirement. There's some other ones with China where providers of telecommunications and internet firms, must also provide encryption keys to Chinese government. And there's some limitations on financial services data. Now with Russia, it's a little bit less strict. And again, with Russia, it's a, pretty new requirement, but based on their data, the personal data law, all data operators that collect data in Russia must first store that first copy of the data in Russia. But then once you store the initial data in Russia, then you can take that and move it to other countries. So Russians just want to be able to have access to that information and have it on premise because it is data collected about their Russian citizens. So, the telecommunications company and internet service providers, they have some additional requirements where they have to also work with the government to make sure that the government approves their operations. But other than that, it's a little bit easier in Russia.
It's a pretty complex topic, I think, and it makes it, challenging, I think, for people to be experts in all things. And I think this is where, this is probably a good situation to divide and conquer, right? Is to pull in the right people when you're ready to have these conversations with with different organizations. Are there any best practices or things that people who are listening can kind of take away to at least, start the conversation with their organization if they haven't already, or if they have, to keep in mind as they kind of start down this journey?
Yeah, I think that to understand your data residency requirements, you have to know what data you already have and where that data currently resides. So if your organization has not done a data inventory and understanding where your data is, that's the first step where I would start. And then, if your organization has already done that data, the next level is looking at transfers. How is the data transferred? A lot of times we actually oversee access controls, right? This is where identity management comes in. In order for us to determine who's accessing the data, we have to do a recertification of all the servers and system in Europe so we can see that Jim and Jeff are located in the US, right? If we look at those access controls, we will quickly identify where the data transfers that may be inappropriate or could be shut down to reduce the scope of applicability.
Yeah, I think reducing the scope is a tactic we've seen before with things like PCI and in-scope systems for SOX, right? Financials, those sorts of things. That makes a lot of sense. I know we're getting short in time here, so I want to pass it around the kind of the horn here real quick. But I also want to mention that you and I are actually both doing a couple of webinars for Protiviti coming up. They're very wordy. Mine is privacy is personal, digital identity's central role in consumer privacy. And I'm doing that with my friend Paul. And you're doing one called The Future is Cloud, Holistic Safeguards to Secure Your Data and Protect Privacy. So hopefully, folks will kind of be able to check those out. I'll put links into our show notes because I don't expect people to remember those names very easily. Real briefly, though, what is your webinar about?
So we're talking about cloud, right? I mean, data residency will be one of the topics as well with cloud. How do you manage that and what and how it applies? We'll talk about the liability, right? With cloud providers, you do get into, we need to understand what is the liability of the cloud provider versus your organization who's a data controller, and do they even have access to the data? So we'll talk about that. And then really we'll focus on data protection. What are the key security, privacy controls that need to be applied to the cloud, as a lot of organizations are making that move to the cloud, right? Everybody's going to the cloud, and some companies don't even know what that means, but they're going to the cloud.
It's just a fad. It'll pass. It's like the internet, right?
I think so.
Any final words of wisdom for us, Katie?
I really enjoyed being here. And I think just, one key takeaway that I want to share is that, a lot of times we start talking about privacy and privacy compliance. I think that if organizations take a step back and really understand that, privacy helps individuals manage boundaries, right, on how they can protect themselves and how they can negotiate who they communicate with, who they interact with, and how they communicate with the world. So, respecting that consumer privacy can really go a long way, because we're starting to see that approach establishes a very strong trust between the organization and consumer. So instead of just focusing 100% on, am I compliant? I recommend organizations take a step back and really look at their relationships and try to accommodate those individuals.
That is great advice. Jim, how about yourself?
Oh, I think that's a great point. Actually, that was what I was going to ask Katie about, is privacy is growing in terms of kind of mind share. And I think from a corporate standpoint, it's how do we become compliant? But we have to ask ourselves the question of, why does it take government regulations to guarantee our privacy rights? And I think that's the bigger question that I even throw back to Katie. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that? Why do we need these regulations in the first place?
I have so many. I mean, Jim, I shared with you, I lived in a country where there was very little privacy. So in my mind, if you think about privacy is a limit on power, right? The more someone knows about us, the more power they really have over us. So personal data is now used to make very important decisions in our lives. Personal data is used to evaluate our behavior, sometimes change our decisions, right? We've seen that happen in, recent, political events. And so I think that, privacy is so important that if there's not a rule or regulation, it's going to be overlooked and it will not be enforced. So I think, unfortunately, you do have to have a governing body who's monitoring and policing it, because otherwise I think it's going to be very difficult to have a standard, right, and to enforce the same standards. But again, speaking from personal experience, privacy is all about power.
I think you're spot on, though, and we've seen, unfortunately, instances where people's private data was abused, and it was done without transparency of how private data was being collected, sold to third parties, used to influence people's political decisions. And I don't think anybody feels good about that, right? And as individuals, we have, like I started the podcast with my example of, you want to sign up to pay your bills online, and all of a sudden you have to agree to a privacy policy, whether you want to agree to it or not. Mm-hmm. And you can make the case that it's an open market. The open market will dictate that, and companies, but the bottom line is most people don't even read the privacy policies, right? They just agree to them and move on. And then all of a sudden data is being sold to a third party, and nobody cares about it until it makes the front page of the news. So anyway, Jeff, the point that I wanted to make, or the thing I wanted to bring up overall, is that, privacy is not specifically IAM, just like our recent show on penetration testing, not specifically IAM, but we're trying to bring more of these strongly related topics into the podcast, because this is a forum for kind of education and all of us learning. I'm learning as we're going with great guests like Katie, kind of sharing this information, and hopefully our guests are getting, or our listeners are getting, a lot out of it. We'd love feedback in terms of what other topics you'd like to hear about. I mean, I really feel like becoming a strong IAM practitioner requires more than just understanding workflows and access management. It's understanding how business operates and some of these major issues that go into architecting IAM systems so they meet the needs of the business and meet the needs of society in general. I think we're getting into societal stuff today, but we'd love that feedback. And as always, we invite people to connect with us via LinkedIn, network with us, send us messages, let us know that, either you like what we're talking about or you want to hear some other things. And, this is your podcast as well. I mean, we want this to be something that people get a lot of value out of.
Yeah, I do think it is important to have topics that are like this, because it is so adjacent to, if there isn't a direct overlap sometimes, although I think there is in this case, you need to be well-rounded from a identity perspective to be able to understand the perspectives that different parts of the organization are bringing to the table, right? And you need to do things like privacy by design, secure by design, right? And take those concepts to be able to drive stakeholder involvement, whoever they may be within the organization. So I think it is important, and I'm very, very happy, and I'm glad we were able to get you on the show, Katie, to kind of, at least start the conversation around privacy. Obviously, there's only so much we can do in about, 45 minutes or an hour, but I think it's worth starting a conversation and at least start to educate and drive awareness towards it, so that we can move towards, this holistic strategy around making sure that at the end of the day, the right person has the right access at the right time, and it's for the right reasons. That's kind of like the simple statement of what IAM is, but there's a lot of different meanings to that and a lot of different tie-ins. So I certainly appreciate being part of the show. We'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. A couple other, just remind again, Identity Management Day, April 13th. You can hit identityManagementDay.org to find out more. You can visit our website at identityatthecenter.com, and you can also follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.